Everyone knows the line, "Curse God and die." 4 words, and for 3,000 years they've been enough to close the book on her, the nagging wife, the weak link, the one who failed the test her husband passed. But nobody stops to ask what she had already lost before she said it. She buried 10 children in one afternoon. Every son, every daughter, gone under a collapsed roof. Then she watched the man she built a life with lose everything else, one messenger at a time, until he was sitting in ashes, scraping his skin with broken pottery, and she was close enough to speak to him. That's who said those 4 words. Not a villain. A grieving mother watching her husband suffer, asking the question a lot of us have asked and been too ashamed to say out loud. Welcome to Applied Bible Wisdom. Today we're going back to the woman everyone quotes and nobody actually listens to. Job chapter 1 moves fast, almost too fast to feel. Sabeans raid and kill the servants tending the oxen and donkeys. Fire falls from the sky and burns up the sheep. Chaldeans steal the camels and kill more servants. And while that messenger is still speaking, a 4th one arrives. A great wind struck the 4 corners of the house where Job's sons and daughters were feasting, and it collapsed on top of all of them. 10 children, gone in the time it takes to hear one sentence. Job's response is famous. He tears his robe, shaves his head, falls to the ground, and worships. The Lord gave, and the Lord has taken away. Blessed be the name of the Lord. Scripture tells us plainly, in all this, Job did not sin or charge God with wrongdoing. What gets skipped is that his wife buried those same 10 children, and the text gives Job a eulogy of faith, but gives her nothing, not one word about her grief. Then, in chapter 2, Satan is given permission to afflict Job's body directly, and he's struck with sores from the soles of his feet to the top of his head. He sits down in the ashes outside the city, scraping himself with broken pottery, and his wife is still there. No verse says she walked away. Whatever else is true about her next words, she stayed close enough to say them to his face. Job 2-9. Then his wife said to him, "Are you still holding on to your integrity? Curse God and die." Here's something most readings skip. The Hebrew word used here for curse is barak, which almost everywhere else in the Old Testament means bless. It's used this way 3 times in Job's opening chapters, every time in a spot where curse is clearly intended, a euphemism many translators and commentators have long noted. Likely, a deliberate softening so something this severe wouldn't stand in plain black ink. Now hear what she's actually saying underneath it. Her husband is diseased, in visible agony, sitting in ash, and by every appearance dying already. She has just watched integrity, his relentless, stubborn faithfulness to God cost him everything and heal nothing. And she's watching him grip his devotion to God even tighter while it costs him more. Curse God and die is not a woman gleefully tempting her husband toward blasphemy. One plausible reading, it's closer to a mercy plea. It's let go. It's, if this integrity has bought you nothing but suffering, stop paying for it. It's the ancient version of a question so many people carry quietly and never say in church. What has holding on to this faith actually gotten either of us, besides more pain? Strip away the shock of the phrase and what's left is a question, not a curse. Why keep believing when belief hasn't stopped a single loss? If faithfulness doesn't protect the people you love, what is it actually for? That's not a question reserved for one bitter woman in an ancient story. It's the question a parent asks in a hospital hallway. A widow asks the year the house feels too quiet. Anyone asks who has stayed faithful and watched the worst happen anyway. If you've ever quietly thought, what is the point of holding on to this? You're standing exactly where Job's wife stood. The tragedy isn't that she asked that question. It's that for 3,000 years, the answer she's been given is silence and a label, foolish. But Job's own reply and what he does 3 chapters later complicates that label a lot more than it suggests. Job 2:10. He said to her, "You speak as one of the foolish women speaks. Shall we receive good from God, and shall we not receive evil?" In all this, Job did not sin with his lips. The word translated foolish here, navel, doesn't mean unintelligent. Throughout the Old Testament, it describes moral senselessness, someone who has stopped orienting their life around God. Psalm 14 uses the same root. The fool says in his heart, "There is no God." Job isn't calling his wife stupid, he's saying her suggestion would mean living as though God doesn't matter anymore. That's the line he won't cross. Notice what he doesn't do, though. He doesn't curse her back, doesn't send her away. She remains his wife. Here's the detail almost no sermon mentions. 1 chapter later, Job opens his own mouth, and what comes out is at least as raw as anything his wife said, arguably more so. "Let the day perish in which I was born. Why did I not die at birth?" He curses the day he was born and says he'd rather have never existed than carry what he's carrying. That's every bit as emotionally intense as "curse God and die," and Scripture does not condemn him for it. If foolish meant the feeling itself is forbidden, Job would be the biggest fool in the book. He isn't. Something else is being measured here. Here's the distinction the book of Job actually draws. Across all 42 chapters, Job spends most of this book arguing, questioning, even accusing God to his face. And at the very end, God doesn't rebuke him for any of it. God rebukes the 3 friends instead, the ones who sat calmly explaining that Job's suffering must be deserved. "You have not spoken of me what is right, as my servant Job has," God tells them. Read that again. The anguished, furious complaints are called right. The tidy explanations that protected everyone from sitting with real grief are called wrong. So the line the book draws isn't between people who feel devastated and people who don't. It's between lament and abandonment. Lament is Job wishing he'd never been born and still bringing that anguish directly to God's face. Abandonment is walking away from the relationship entirely, curse God and die at its most final reading, the door shutting for good. Job's own outburst is just as raw, he just keeps walking toward God with it instead of away. That's the difference. Not the size of the pain, where you carry it. Job 2-9 is the last time we ever hear her speak. Not one more line. No apology, no vindication, no closing scene of her own. The book gives Job pages of speeches, arguments, and eventually a personal audience with God out of a whirlwind. It gives her 4 words and then nothing. And yet Job chapter 42 says God restored Job's fortunes and gave him twice what he'd had before: 7 sons, 3 daughters, 10 children again. The text never mentions Job remarrying. If not, one plausible and hardest reading is that the same woman who buried 10 children in a single afternoon is the one who some years later bore and raised 10 more. Scripture never lets her narrate that. We don't get to hear whether she trusted again slowly, whether the fear of loving and losing again nearly broke her, whether she ever stopped bracing herself. She's simply there, unnamed in the ending the way she was, unnamed in the grief, present for the whole story, and never once asked how she's doing. If you've ever quietly wondered whether your faith has bought you anything but pain, you are not disqualified from this story. You're in it. You're standing exactly where she stood. Here's the honest prayer, the one the book of Job actually models, chapter after chapter, long before it ever resolves. God, I don't understand why this happened. I'm not going to pretend I do. I'm not going to pretend it doesn't hurt, or that I'm fine, or that I'm not asking why I should keep holding on. But I'm going to keep bringing this to you instead of walking away from you. That's lament. That's not a failure of faith. It may be one of the most honest forms faith takes. Job's wife asked the question so many of us are afraid to say in church. Scripture doesn't answer her, but it spends 42 chapters showing what it looks like to ask that same question and stay. If this is where you are today, bring it to God exactly as it is, not the polished version, the real one. And if you know someone sitting in their own ashes right now, afraid that asking, why keep believing, makes them the failure in the story, send them this. She wasn't the failure. She was just the first one, honest enough to say it out loud. If this spoke to you, subscribe to Applied Bible Wisdom. We sit with the questions other channels skip past every week.